You found your way back to the cellar. Good. The mountains are heavy tonight. The fog is thick enough to swallow a man whole. I've spent the last few weeks gathering the tapes that were too jagged, too restless to leave alone. I've stitched them together into one long record. 3 hours of the things that crawl in the gaps between the trees. Close your eyes. Let the rain wash away the world outside. The archives are open, and we have all night. This reel's been in the can a long time. Older than the clinic. Older than the road that brought the clinic here. Up in the holler they'll tell you, not every birth calls for a doctor. Some call for her. The one who knows which way the rock bleeds. Who can read a labor in the way a seam of copper bends through slate. She's been at this longer than anyone cares to count. Just mind yourself when you watch. There are things that come into the world her way that weren't exactly invited, and she has never once lost one. That's the part that ought to worry you. Imagine standing in a field at night where the rain falls sideways, and every droplet tastes like copper pennies. The smell of oxidized metal mixes with something darker, like earth after a burial. Thomas Calloway stood in such a field, boots sinking into mud that felt too warm despite the October chill. The family stood around him in a semicircle, their skin shimmering with faint metallic sheen. A young girl smiled with eyes that reflected moonlight like a deer's, but wrong, too knowing. The mother figure stood apart, her dress hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at her. Her belly rippled beneath the fabric like something living beneath skin that no longer belonged to her. And Thomas understood, in that moment, what he had done, what his hands had been made to do. The realization settled into his chest like a stone dropping into still water. And the rain continued to fall on his shoulders, already coating him in a fine copper dust that he would never quite wash away. Thomas Calloway had learned that sleep was the body's way of preparing for death. As a veterinarian for 40 years, he had coaxed animals through their final rest. Great draft horses and cattle whose eyes grew soft as sedatives took hold. Now retired at 73, living alone in a cottage on Blackbird Ridge, he found himself thinking about sleep differently. It was not rest. It was a small death we practiced each night. A rehearsal for something larger waiting in the dark. The rain had been falling for 3 weeks, steady, patient, the kind that spoke of settling and accumulation. From his window, Thomas watched the tin roof of his tool shed catch droplets, each one making its tiny sound, until the individual impacts became a single continuous note. The cottage was small and intentional. 4 rooms, fireplace, kitchen, living room with the grandfather clock, and a bedroom where he spent most of his waking hours reading old veterinary journals from the 1940s, back when doctoring was still intimate, still something that acknowledged the sacred space between healer and creature in pain. On the night the stranger came, Thomas was reading about birth complications in cattle, about turning a calf inside the womb when everything had gone wrong. The rain was particularly loud. When the knocking came, it was so soft he almost missed it. Not a knock, but deliberate touches against the door, patient and unhurried. The man standing in the doorway was difficult to look at. Not wounded or grotesque, but something about his face resisted clear description. Thomas's eyes slid across his features like water across oil, taking impressions but no specifics. His skin held the exact tone of an old penny oxidized to dull green-brown. His eyes seemed to contain no pupil, or rather, the entire eye was pupil, dark and bottomless. He blinked approximately once every 2 minutes. "I am here about a birth," the man said softly. "The family sent me. You are the veterinarian, the one who understands passage." Thomas's hands tightened on the doorframe. He had left that life deliberately, severing himself from the work of intervention, and yet the stranger's request settled into something in his chest that had not yet died. Some part of him that still believed being useful was the same as being alive. "Who sent you?" "The Deep Hollow families. We have a mother in a difficult stage. We need someone who understands what to do when natural processes have become complicated." Thomas found himself nodding. His body was already agreeing to something his conscious mind had not yet articulated. The stranger smiled very slightly. "Come," the man said. "The rain is patient, but not forever." Thomas did not remember driving exactly. He remembered the stranger's station wagon smelling like copper pipes and minerals. And then they were on roads that grew progressively smaller until they were on a track barely navigable. They descended into the deep hollow, a place that didn't appear on maps, that seemed to slide past the eye without registering. The trees were wrong. Not bare as they should be in October, but retaining leaves in a color Thomas could not name. Not autumn gold or red, but something metallic, greenish gold that shimmered and absorbed light, then emitted it again. "The mist," the stranger said, the first word since entering the valley. Thomas breathed and tasted metal, mineral-rich wrongness coating his tongue and throat. The mist had entered the car, or had always been there. It was not wet like fog, but like breathing in a place where air had been oxidized, reduced to mineral components, stripped of nitrogen and oxygen and left with only copper and iron. With each breath, Thomas felt less like a man moving through the world and more like a man being moved through it. The car came to rest without any conscious decision. The stranger turned slowly, his entire face now the color of tarnished copper, his eyes seeming larger. "Walk," he said, "up the rise. The house waits." The farmhouse appeared because his walking led him there, as if the path led inevitably in only one direction. The structure was ancient. A leaning thing made of wood turned the color of stone, and stone turned the color of bone. Every surface was covered in growth that glinted faintly, the texture of minerals being slowly integrated into living wood, as if the house itself was undergoing petrification. From every available surface hung copper wire and charms. They hung from eaves and gutters, from twisted oak branches, from hooks deliberately installed on walls. Each charm was small, no larger than a thumb, made of something that caught what little light penetrated the mist and held it briefly before releasing it. The chimes moved in a rhythm that had no apparent source. There was no wind, yet they moved, and with each movement came that subtle, crystalline percussion, almost beautiful and almost maddening in its constancy. The stranger was no longer behind him. Thomas understood this without turning. His guides had accomplished their task. Now he was alone with the house, with the clinking, with the copper mist that had settled into his lungs so completely he could no longer distinguish between inhalation and exhalation. The door opened as he approached, though no hand touched it. Inside, the air was different, warmer, thick with the smell of birth, amniotic fluid, blood, the opening of tissue that had never been opened before. But underneath, something else, the smell of a penny left in soil, the earth itself weeping copper. A woman stood in what had once been a living room, holding a kerosene lamp that cast dancing shadows. "You are the doctor," she said. "You are the one sent to help." Thomas did not remember agreeing, but his body nodded. They descended wooden stairs that creaked as if offended by his weight. The cellar was not dark. The copper mist provided luminescence between moonlight and the light of deep water. The walls were not stone or wood, but something amalgamated. Layers of mineral deposits, copper and iron and things without names, arranged in patterns that might have been accidental or conscious. The woman gestured toward a corner. Thomas moved toward it without willing himself. His body had become separate from his consciousness. On a pallet of animal hides lay the mother. She was not entirely human, though she retained enough of the form that the term might apply. Her body was extended beyond normal dimensions, swollen in ways suggesting final stage pregnancy. But her skin was no longer skin. It was something beginning to transform. In the copper mist light, Thomas could see branching patterns of copper wire running beneath her surface, visible as a luminescent network. Veins no longer carrying blood, but something metallic. Something replacing her cellular structure with what could survive beneath the earth. Her eyes were open and tracked his movement with complete awareness. She was not sedated. She was present, watching with the intelligence of someone undergoing transformation she fully comprehended. There was no mercy in her gaze, only acknowledgement. "The ripening is advanced," the woman said softly. "We have waited generations for a body that could carry this long enough for the seed to mature. But the final stages, we need a human hand to guide what wants to be born." "What is she carrying?" Thomas asked. "The future," the woman said simply. "Something the mountain has been trying to grow in human soil. The copper in the earth, the copper in the mist, the copper in the bones of this place. It has learned to think, to feel, to want. Your job is to help it remember what it wants to become." She reached out her arm, a motion that took a very long time, each joint moving with apparent deliberation. Her hand was covered entirely in the copper network, barely a hand at all, more like a thing made of branches and mineral that had learned to approximate the shape of a hand. On her palm lay something small. It was difficult for Thomas to perceive directly, the way his eyes had slid across a stranger's face, but he could sense it. Something warm, alive, primarily composed of copper. A seed, or an egg, or something serving both functions. The ripened thing that had been growing inside her body while her body slowly became less human and more like a vessel. A mine shaft that had learned to contain life. "This is what must be harvested," the woman said. "Your hands know how to retrieve what the body has created. Your hands know how to distinguish between vessel and seed, between what must remain and what must be released." Thomas understood then. He was not here to deliver a living child. He was here to extract this copper seed that had been growing in human flesh, that had been replacing human flesh, that had been slowly transforming a woman into a container. He reached out, and his hands moved with the muscle memory of 40 years, the gentle precision of a man who had guided calves and colts into the world, who had known how to place his hands in delicate spaces between one state of being and another. The seed fell into his palm, impossibly warm, pulsing with a heartbeat not quite synchronized with his own. He could feel it thrumming there, trying to establish resonance with the copper-laced blood moving through his veins. The woman smiled, the most human expression he had seen. "Now run," she said. "Run until the mountain releases you. But know you are already changed. The copper mist remembers what it has touched. It will follow you." Thomas ran. The cellar fell away. The farmhouse became a shape in the mist, receding with impossible speed. The car appeared in his path as if waiting. The keys were in the ignition. The engine started without resistance. He emerged into the normal world gasping, disoriented, as if drowning, and returned to life. The rain was falling, normal rain, the kind that tasted of minerals but not copper. His cottage appeared, and he drove toward it without conscious intention. Inside, with doors locked and every light burning, Thomas looked at his hands. The copper sheen had not faded. It had settled deeper, incorporated itself into his skin, becoming part of him. He could no longer remove it by washing. The seed had been placed on his mantle. He did not remember removing it from his pocket, but it was there, resting against a photo of himself from 30 years prior, when he had still believed that saving lives was the same as living. The seed had stopped pulsing. It lay inert but not dead, patient, waiting. And so Thomas Calloway sat in his cottage, watching the seed on his mantle, understanding he had become something other than what he had been. The copper mist had not remained in the valley. It had followed him, as promised, residing in the spaces between his cells, in the copper wire beginning to branch through his blood, in the slow replacement of everything he had been with something the mountain wanted him to become. The rain falls on his tin roof still. The grandfather clock ticks in his living room still. But now, listening to these sounds, he hears something underneath, like the clinking of 1,000 tiny charms, like the earth itself learning to think, learning to grow, learning to harvest what it has sown in human soil. If you taste metal on your tongue tonight, don't swallow. Just close your eyes and let the mountain take the weight. Some of us were chosen long before we were born to be vessels for what the earth is trying to become. And in the deep hollows of the world, in the places that don't appear on maps, in the copper-colored mist that settles over ancient farmhouses, the becoming continues. It has always been continuing. It will never stop. Thomas has learned to sleep again, but his sleep is different now. It is the sleep of something learning to transform, the sleep of patience and copper-deep change. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the rain is falling and the clock is ticking and the world is still, he can hear them, the other vessels, all over the region, all in their cottages and farmhouses and hidden places, all breathing the copper mist, all carrying seeds toward some harvest that only the mountain understands. They are waiting, and the mountain, patient and ancient and aware, is waiting with them. Thank you for listening to Case File 075. Thank you for sitting with us in the dark, for letting the copper mist settle into your own lungs, for hearing the chiming of those distant charms in the spaces between your heartbeats. The mountains are full of stories like Thomas's, stories that live in the hollows and the hidden places, stories that have been waiting a very long time to be heard. And now that you have heard this one, it lives with you too, not as a burden, but as a companion, as something that understands what it means to transform slowly in the dark, while the rain falls and the clock ticks on. So close your eyes now. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of the rain. Let your heartbeat sync with the ticking of the clock. You are safe here in the darkness, safe in this moment between waking and sleep, between one day and the next. Sleep tight, dear listener, and if you dream of copper mist, of distant chimes, of a farmhouse leaning in the dark, know that the mountain is simply saying hello. Know that you are not alone in the night. We will see you again soon. The static on this one never quite clears. We've cleaned the reel twice. Don't think it's the reel. There was a man, deep in the county, who could mend any break you brought him. Compound, spiral, the kind that made other men look away, didn't matter. His hands knew what to do. What did matter was the filling, what he packed into the gaps where the bone had given up on itself. They say he called it a poultice. Those who walked out of his cabin called it other things, mostly in the dark, mostly when the leg started to ache in a direction it hadn't before. He never lost a patient to the break. Can't speak to what they lost to him, though. Just, if you feel something shift in your own bones while you're watching, don't stand up too fast. Give it a moment. Let it settle into whatever it's becoming. Well now, friend, settle yourself in. You found your way to the redacted archives, that place where we keep the stories that the mountains don't quite want to let go of. My name don't much matter anymore, and what I'm about to share with you concerns a man named Silas, a surveyor by trade, and a hollow place in these Appalachian hills they call the Marrow Thicket. This here is case file 079. Now I'll tell you true, this ain't a story meant to frighten you sudden like. No, sir. This is the kind of tale that settles into your bones slow and patient, like cold seeping through old cabin walls come November. So dim your lights down low and listen close to the recovered audio that follows. They found what was left to Silas Hartwell 3 years after he disappeared into the Marrow Thicket. He stood at the ridge line above the creek bed, thin as a stripped sapling, his skin the color of hemlock bark, weathered gray by 10,000 seasons. His eyes were still open, still looking down into those hollows where the mist never quite clears. There was no mark upon him, no wound, no blood. Just a man who had become something else entirely. Something that belonged to the mountain in a way the living never could. The old folks whispered that if you listen careful on certain nights, you can still hear him breathing with the wind through the pass. A sound like air moving through hollowed bone. Silas Hartwell came to these mountains in late autumn of 1987, carrying his survey equipment and the kind of confidence that only a man who'd never truly suffered can hold. He was hired to map the eastern reaches of the Marrow Thicket, a stretch of land so tangled that even the county didn't rightly understand what lay within it. The timber companies wanted to know if it was worth taking. Silas had done this work before, tramped through Pennsylvania forests and Virginia hollows, but he'd never been to the Marrow Thicket. He hadn't heard the stories, or if he had, he hadn't believed them. The way young men don't quite believe the stories their elders tell with such care and such sadness. The locals tried to warn him. There was an old woman at the last settlement before the trail went wild. She sat on a porch that was barely holding itself together, and she looked at Silas with eyes that had seen things that never made it into the official records. "Don't go down into them hollows after the sun passes certain trees," she said. Her voice was thin, like wind through a crack in old wood. The mountain don't like strangers in the thicket, and it's got ways of dealing with folks who don't respect the silence. Silas smiled the way young men do when they think they're being kind to someone afraid of the dark. He thanked her and drove as far as he could up a winding road. The rest he'd have to do on foot, The weather was fair to middling that morning. Cool, but not yet what you'd call cold. The mist hung in the hollows like something that had learned to breathe. And the trees, Lord, the trees were so tall and so thick that it was hard to remember what the sky looked like. Hemlock trees mostly, dark as old blood against the gray sky. The ground was soft with needles and damp with something that wasn't quite rain. Silas marked his trail as he went, cutting blazes into the bark with his surveying knife. He looked through his telescope at distant ridges, and he walked. Lord, how he walked. It was around the time the sun started thinking about leaving for the day that he realized he couldn't quite remember which direction was back. This don't happen to surveyors, you understand. They're trained to keep their sense of direction like a compass keeps pointing north. But the marrow thicket has a way of turning a man's mind like a key in a lock. The hollows all look the same. The ridges double back on themselves in ways that don't quite make sense. And the mist gets thicker as evening comes, until you can't quite remember if you've been walking for 2 hours or 2 days. Silas found himself on a rocky slope where the ground gave way beneath his feet. He was reaching for a hemlock to catch himself when the slope decided it was done holding him up. He fell down, tumbling through darkness and branches, and every rock he hit was colder than the last, until finally there was nothing beneath him but air. He landed in the creek bed below, and something in his left leg gave way with a sound like a branch snapping. The pain was the kind that makes you see colors that don't exist in the natural world. The creek was cold. Not the clean cold of a mountain spring, but something deeper and older. Silas lay there on the stones, his leg twisted beneath him, the mist rising up around him like something curious and slow. He must have lain there for hours, and that's when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a rhythm. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the rocky creek bed, and beneath it, a sliding, scraping sound. A figure emerged from the mist. The man was tall and bent, and he moved with a kind of slowness that suggests every movement is being carefully considered. His clothes were old, not just worn, but old in a way suggesting decades. And his hands were large, with fingers that bent in directions fingers shouldn't bend. "You've hurt yourself," the figure said. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together in a riverbed. The mountain don't take kindly to trespassers that don't respect the fallen down places. Silas tried to speak, but the pain made it come out as a whimper. The figure knelt beside him and began to examine the broken leg with surprising gentleness. "Name's Bone-Setter," the figure said. "Old Bone-Setter. I live in the thicket. Been living here since before your granddaddy was born, reckon. I know how to fix what the mountain breaks. Silas should have been afraid of this creature that emerged from the dark like something that belonged more to the landscape and to the human world. But fear and pain and desperation can make a man accept things he ordinarily wouldn't. "Can you help me?" Silas asked. The Bone-Setter smiled, and it was a smile without warmth in it. "I can help you," he said, "but it'll cost you." "I've got money," Silas started. But the Bone-Setter wasn't talking about money. "What I'm talking about is something different. I'm going to set your bones true, but you're going to have to accept my methods. No doctors, no modern medicines, just the old way, the mountain way." Silas, lying there in the dark with his legs screaming in pain, agreed. The Bone-Setter's home was built into the side of a hollow, where an overhang of stone created shelter, and where hemlock trees grew so thick they seemed to have woven themselves into a roof. The structure itself was hard to look at. It seemed to shift depending on the angle of your gaze, as if it wasn't quite sure what shape it wanted to be. The Bone-Setter carried Silas there, moving slow and careful, his strength surprising in something that looked so bent and ancient. Inside, the place smelled like earth and age, like things that had been growing and dying in the dark for a very long time. There were shelves carved into the stone walls, and on those shelves were jars, hundreds of them, filled with pale, hard, bone-colored things. "Don't worry yourself about those," the Bone-Setter said. "Those are the tools of my trade. Been collecting them for a long, long time. Every piece of old bone in this mountain, seems like, makes its way to me eventually. The mountain gives, the mountain takes, and the mountain remembers." The Bone-Setter laid Silas on a bed made of straw and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like bone beneath the covering. And then, with movements that were practiced and sure, he began to work. He removed Silas's boot and examined the leg in detail. His fingers moved along the broken places with surprising gentleness. Then he stood and went to one of the shelves and selected something from one of the jars. It was a piece of bone, pale and smooth, about the size of a man's finger. He heated it over a small fire, not like normal fires burn, but something dimmer and greener, and he began to work it into a paste with herbs Silas couldn't identify. The smell was strange, not entirely unpleasant, but not entirely pleasant either. Something old, something that had been waiting a very long time to be used. The bone-setter applied this paste to the broken leg with precision, suggesting he'd done this many times before. And the strangest thing happened. The pain began to subside. Not all at once, but gradually. Within an hour, Silas was sleeping deeply. He stayed in that hollow for 3 weeks. That's what he thought anyway. It was hard to keep track of time in a place where the sun didn't seem to move through the sky in any normal fashion. The bone-setter cared for him with dedication, suggesting he took professional pride in his work. Every morning, or what passed for morning, he would examine the leg and apply new poultices made from bone and herbs. And slowly, impossibly, the leg began to heal. But something else was happening, too. Something Silas didn't quite notice at first because it was so gradual. The bone-setter's grafting process wasn't just healing the broken bone. It was replacing it. Silas could feel it, a sensation like small stones shifting beneath the skin, like something being slowly exchanged for something else. When he asked the bone-setter about it, the old man would just smile that smile without warmth. You can't put old bone into new flesh and expect nothing to change, the bone-setter said. The old bone remembers things, remembers being part of the mountain, and it wants to go back. By the time 3 weeks had passed, the leg was whole again, stronger than it had been before. The bone-setter told him he could leave whenever he wanted to. The mountain would guide him back, the old man said. But when Silas tried to leave, he found his body didn't quite respond the way it used to. He felt lighter and colder, and there was a strange sensation in his bones, like ice moving through his veins in slow rhythm. He made it back to civilization, though he would never quite be able to explain the route he took. His supervisor found him 3 days later, wandering on the edge of the county road, barely recognizable. Silas had lost 30 pounds. His skin had taken on a pale grayish quality. His eyes had a strange, distant quality, as if he was looking at the world from a very far distance. The doctors examined him, found nothing physically wrong. His broken leg had healed perfectly, too perfectly. The bone itself had the density of something much older than human bone, something more like stone. Silas told them about the bone-setter, but they wrote it down as fever dreams, as delirium brought on by pain and dehydration. But the strangeness didn't end when he left the marrow thicket. The transformation continued. Over the following months, Silas felt himself becoming something other than human. The weight continued to drop away. His body temperature fell so low that his friends became concerned. His appetite diminished until he was eating almost nothing, and his thoughts became slower, dreamier. as if his very mind was being replaced with something that operated on a different frequency. The strange sensation in his bones intensified. It wasn't painful exactly. It was more like his structure was being slowly altered, as if the old bone was spreading through his body like roots growing through soil. He could feel his spine changing, his ribs reshaping themselves, the bones of his fingers lengthening. His friends abandoned him. They said he was sick, that something was terribly wrong. But Silas could feel that nothing was wrong. He was becoming what he was meant to become, and the mountains called to him. Every night he felt the pull of the marrow thicket, like a hook embedded in his chest. The need to return grew stronger with each passing week. He couldn't work, couldn't maintain his apartment, couldn't engage in the normal functions of human life. By the third year, Silas was barely recognizable as human anymore. He'd become something hollow, something light. His skin clung to his bones like paper, and those bones were no longer quite bone. They were something harder, something whiter, something that seemed to reflect light in ways that normal bone never could. And one autumn night, when the mist was rising thick off the creek beds in the Appalachian hills, Silas walked back into the marrow thicket. The trail that had taken him hours to navigate before, he covered as if the mountain itself was carrying him. And he came to the ridgeline that overlooks the silent hollow, and he stood there, looking down into the mist, and he understood what had happened to him. He wasn't sick. He was becoming part of the mountain. The old bone that the Bone-Setter had grafted onto him was pulling him back to the place where it had originated, to the stone and the earth from which it had come. He was being slowly reassimilated, slowly absorbed back into the landscape that had never wanted him to leave. He stood on that ridgeline and let the transformation complete itself. The witnesses who found him 3 years later, local hunters who knew better than to venture into the thicket but ventured there anyway, they said that when they touched him, he felt like stone. His skin was already taking on the color of hemlock bark. His fingers had become like twigs, and in the wind that passes through the pass above the silent hollow, on the cold nights when the mist hangs heavy and the mountains seem to be breathing all around you, well, folks say you can still hear him breathing. A sound like wind moving through hollowed bone. A sound like the mountain speaking to itself. And sometimes, on those cold nights when the mist won't clear, Travelers report seeing a figure standing on the ridge above the marrow thicket, watching the trail below, waiting perhaps for the next surveyor who doesn't know the stories, the next young man with his instruments and his confidence, walking down into the hollows where the bone-setter is always waiting, always working, always collecting the old bone that the mountain brings to him. Because the mountain, you see, it has a way of taking care of itself. This is case file 079, the Hemlock Bone-Setter. And the next time you hear the mountains breathing, the next time you hear that sound like wind through hollowed bone, well, you might wonder who else is listening in the dark. This one came to us on a tape with no label. Found it coiled in the grass at the base of an old broadcast tower out past the county line. The one that went dark in '63 or so, they said. We don't know who left it. We're not entirely sure it was left for us. There's a voice on the recording. Low, warm, the kind of voice that makes you feel like you've just stepped inside somewhere after a long time out in the cold. It talks about simple things mostly. Weather, the way light moves through glass. It sounds like it knows you, which is the part you have to watch for. Honey doesn't think. Honey doesn't plan. It just does what its nature tells it to do. Holds on, pulls down, keeps still. The hive is the one with the agenda. If the voice starts to sound familiar, if you catch yourself thinking you've heard it somewhere before, don't try to place it. That's the moment it starts placing you. Let me tell you about the people in those remote mountain hollows, the ones where fog never quite lifts, even in July. where creeks run dark and don't reflect the sky. Every evening as the sun goes down, they set the table for supper. 1 plate, 2 plates, sometimes 3. But the last plate is different. That one's set for the dead. Perfect silver forks, old ones that belonged to grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers. On that plate they put just a little of everything they're eating. A spoonful of beans, a piece of cornbread, water drawn from the well before sunrise. They call it the silent supper. And the rule is simple. You don't speak while that plate is set. Not a word, not a whisper. Not even to ask someone to pass the salt. The government didn't care about old traditions. Not at first. But in 1952, the Department of Energy came to Bitter Creek. They said uranium. They sent men in suits with clipboards. They measured things. They made maps. 1 map survived. 63 years later, it was filed away in an archive at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The title read, Acoustic Dampening Survey, Bitter Creek Watershed. Classification level, restricted. A retired frequency analyst named Martin Sewell knew exactly what that meant. When he inherited his uncle's cabin at the edge of Bitter Creek, he found something that explained everything. Martin was 71 when he inherited the cabin. He'd spent his entire life listening to frequencies, radio waves, electromagnetic fields, the invisible humming the world makes when you know how to listen. The government had paid him well for this. 43 years in facilities so hidden they weren't on any map. The cabin should have been empty, but when Martin arrived, the air felt kept, like someone had been maintaining it. The fireplace had wood stacked neatly beside it. The cupboards had jars of preserves, all dated 1962. The first drawer he opened held official papers. At first he thought they might be deeds, but the letterhead made him stop. The Department of Energy seal. His hand started shaking. It was a protocol, a government protocol. Title, Regulations for Acoustic Preservation, Bitter Creek Temporal Anomaly, Code Orange Classification. Below it, a signature from someone named Dr. Harold Weston, Director, Oak Ridge Division. The first regulation was simple. All household members must observe the silent supper protocol every evening from sunset to sunrise. No speaking, whispering, singing, or intentional vocalization is permitted. The second regulation outlined fines. Violation through acoustic disturbance. The amount seemed arbitrary. $300, 847, 2100. Then Martin understood. They were keyed to something. Probably the frequency of the disturbance. The more you spoke, the more you owed. The third regulation mentioned compensatory acoustic harvesting and suggested that residents who followed the protocol would receive federal agricultural subsidies. That was the bargain. That was why people stayed. Martin found more documents. Purchase orders for brass instruments from 1954. Specifications for harmonic dampening equipment. The parts list was detailed. High-density brass tubing, resonance chambers, frequency modulators. He found a receipt for 17 units delivered via unmarked transport. The documents were dated up until 1982. Then they stopped. After 1982, the protocols just ended. They were never formally rescinded. They just stopped being maintained. But the brass dampeners, the industrial-sized harmonic devices hidden in the woods, those had never stopped running. The schematics showed 17 machines buried in those woods, humming beneath the leaves and soil. A low brown noise, the color of old leather, the color of dried blood. Martin decided to stay in the cabin. He told himself it was practical, but the truth was that he was terrified of leaving. The protocols had been clear even after all these years. On the first evening, he set the silent supper himself. 2 plates, one for him, one for the dead. He ate without speaking, listening to the humming in the air, that same low brown noise. By the 4th evening, he'd stopped calling anyone. The cabin seemed to resist contact with the outside world. His phone worked, but conversations sounded muffled, like speaking through water. The fog came on the 7th night. It rolled down from the ridge so thick that the world beyond 10 feet simply ceased to exist. He heard it around dusk. At first he thought perhaps someone was outside, a man perhaps. The sound was almost like singing, almost like words. But it was underneath the words, like harmony beneath melody. It vibrated in his chest. It made his teeth sing. Martin stepped outside. The fog swallowed him. He could see nothing, but the humming continued, circling. It wasn't threatening. It was inviting, like the sound of a door opening, like the sound of someone saying your name, but with their entire body instead of their voice. He should have stayed inside, should have remembered the first regulation. "Who's there?" he called into the fog. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than any silence Martin had experienced in his 71 years. It was the silence of every silent supper. Decades of held breath. decades of unspoken grief. Then from the fog, a figure emerged. It was wearing a suit made of yellowed linen, the color of old bone, old teeth. It hung perfectly on a frame that suggested a human body, though something about the proportions was wrong. The arms were too long. The head was too still. It didn't walk so much as flow through the fog. The face was handsome in the way old photographs are handsome, smooth, serene. But the eyes were reflecting pools. When Martin looked into them, he saw his own face, dozens of versions, all of them scared. The guest smiled. It had very good teeth. "You called," it said. The voice was smooth as honey, old honey, the kind that's been sitting in a glass for 100 years, crystallized at the edges. Martin should have run, but he found himself inviting the guest inside, found himself gesturing to the warmth of the fire, found himself breaking the protocol. The guest moved through the cabin like it knew the place. It sat in the chair across from the unset, silent supper plate with familiar ease. "You've read the regulations," the guest said. Not a question. Martin nodded. He could smell it now. Honey. But underneath was something else. Spoilage. Rot. The sweet smell of fruit left in a closed room too long. "They brought me here in 1952, the guest continued. They had studied the frequencies. They learned that acoustic phenomena could separate what is kept from what is given away, the soul from the sound, the spirit from the speech. The fire was still burning, but Martin couldn't hear the crackle anymore. The logs shifted silently in the flames. "They fed me at first," the guest said. "They brought me voices from radios, television signals, the broadcast hum of electricity. For 30 years they fed me the sounds of the living world, carefully curated. I grew so fat on your civilization's signal." The guest smiled. "But the equipment failed. The protocols were abandoned, and I became hungry. The silent supper was never meant to feed the dead," the guest explained, leaning forward. "The dead doesn't eat anything. The silent supper was meant to collect sound. Every evening, in every household, a silence so heavy it could be harvested. Silence that weighed something in the world." The guest began to hum, the same humming from the fog. But now it was inside the cabin, and it was different. It was the frequency of something being pulled, something being drawn out. Martin felt it in his teeth first. The vibration increased. His molars began to ache. Then he felt it in his throat. His voice, the thing he'd used for 71 years, began to feel like it was being pulled out of him, like thread. Like someone was reaching down his throat and extracting yarn, meter after meter, pulling his words out into the humming air, and the guest was consuming it. The clock on the mantelpiece stopped. The tick, tick, tick simply ceased. The fire made no sound. The wind outside made no sound. Even Martin's heartbeat had gone silent in his ears. Only the humming remained. Only the sensation of his voice being drawn out like smoke up a chimney. 71 years, the guest whispered. 71 years of quiet, of compliance, of following regulations you never understood. I will take all of it. Every word you never spoke, every comment you never made, every prayer you never voiced, every scream that stayed in your chest. The guest opened its mouth wider than should have been possible. Inside was nothing, a black space, a vacuum. And Martin felt his entire voice, every conversation he'd ever had, crystallizing and being pulled into that space. Martin doesn't know how long before he finally found the radio. Minutes, hours, days perhaps. His throat was raw but silent. The radio was beneath the floorboards in the bedroom. Military-grade transmitter. A frequency was already dialed in. When he pressed the button to transmit, a voice answered immediately. Calm, clinical, professional. Specimen 078-B, the voice said. Your status update is being recorded. Please indicate current vocal capacity. Martin opened his mouth. Nothing came out but air. Understood, the voice continued. Vocal matter consumption at 98.7%. Wax production at optimal levels. Subject will continue harvesting cycle until saturation point is reached. Federal compensation will be deposited quarterly per original agreement. You may continue the silent supper protocol indefinitely. The voice was female, maybe. Or maybe it was just a voice designed to sound like it came from nowhere. Like it came from the frequency itself. Wait, Martin tried to say. But nothing came out. He pressed the button again. Made desperate sounds his throat could no longer form into words. Specimen 078-B. Vocal disturbance detected. Please maintain silence protocol. Disturbance levels are affecting wax purity. Further violations will result in suspension of federal compensation. Martin realized what had happened. The government hadn't sent the guest to save the people of Bitter Creek. They'd sent it to farm them, to harvest the cumulative silence of an entire community and transform it into something else. something that crystallized, something with value. The guest was producing wax. The honey-colored wax coated every surface of the cabin. That amber substance nobody talked about, that had always been there. The radio continued. Wax production, 4.2 tons to date. Specimen 078-B represents 17% increase in annual output. Analysis indicates vocal suppression at generational level has created optimal crystalline structure. Continue protocol indefinitely. "10 years later, a LiDAR technician named David Reeves was surveying the ridge above Bitter Creek. The work was routine, mapping soil composition for a Department of Interior forestry study. Nothing unusual. But when he looked at the LiDAR readout near the Sewell cabin coordinates, something was wrong. The data showed a structure completely filled, not with earth or wood, but with something else. Something that rendered as pale amber. The entire cabin was filled with it, floor to ceiling. Wax. When David hiked down, he found the cabin exactly as the data suggested. It was barely standing, held together by the weight of thousands of pounds of crystallized wax. The walls looked like they were made of old honey. The windows were sealed shut with it. Inside, he found a voice recorder. Ancient. A reel-to-reel tape machine from the 1970s. When David pressed play, an old man's voice filled the space. Beneath it, the faint humming begins again. The voice was barely a whisper, almost not a voice at all. But it was there. "My name is Martin Sewell," the tape whispered. "I am specimen 078-B. The protocol is eternal. The guest is always hungry. The wax is always growing. If you're hearing this, and maybe I finally managed to record the frequency of my own consumption." The tape crackled. The humming seemed to get louder. The silent supper is still set every evening in the cabins around Bitter Creek. The government never came back to maintain the equipment, but the dampening machines still hum in the ground. The people still speak in whispers. They still set that plate for the dead. The voice on the tape became even softer. If you have read the regulations, then you know. If you have set the silent supper, then you know. If you have ever heard the humming in the damp mountain air, that honey-colored frequency that vibrates your teeth, then you know. The tape continued to play, but the voice was now barely perceptible, a whisper beneath whispers. The guest is not at the cabin anymore. It moved on. It always moves on when one host is fully harvested. And it's singing now somewhere in the fog. and people are setting places at their tables. And the silence is growing so thick you could cut it with a knife. The voice faded further. The humming seemed to take its place, becoming the narrator now. It's so quiet here now, so perfectly quiet. I think I'm finally understanding the protocol. The protocol is that there is no ending. The protocol is that the silence just keeps growing, getting thicker, getting sweeter. Set your table tomorrow evening. Don't speak. Don't break the rule. The guest is listening. The guest is always so. The tape crackled into white noise. The humming faded to almost nothing. Just the sound of something breathing. Just the whisper of old air moving through old wax. The humming drops to nearly nothing, barely perceptible. Just the darkness now, just the amber color of old honey in the moonlight. Just the fog rolling down from the ridge, so thick you can't see anything beyond it. Just silence. We're past the middle of it now. The archive gets thinner from here, but not quieter, never quieter. This next one is difficult to categorize. Technically, it's a recording, but calling it sound doesn't quite cover it. More like structure. Pattern with intention behind it. Someone, somewhere, learned how to weave with the throat, the way you'd work a loom, warp and weft, tension and release, the shuttle passing through in a rhythm that gets into you before you've had the chance to decide whether you wanted it to. We've had listeners describe it as feeling something tighten just below the jaw, a pulling sensation, like a stitch being drawn. One man said it felt like being hemmed. He didn't mean it as a complaint, which was perhaps the most unsettling part. The rhythm is the thing. It has a logic to it, and your body, without asking your permission, will want to follow that logic. Don't. Keep your mouth closed. Keep your throat still. Whatever it's making in there, don't help it along. Some fabrics aren't meant to come off the loom in one piece. Some are only finished when they find the right frame to stretch across. I don't know if this is recording. The battery light is red. It's always red now, ever since I brought it near the opening. I found one of the threads outside the cave, I mean. It had come loose from the rock face, and it was just laying across the path like a tripwire. Silver, thinner than hair. And I touched it because I didn't know. I didn't know yet what they were. It vibrated when I touched it, the way a guitar string vibrates. And I heard my mother's voice. My mother has been dead for 11 years. She said my name, just my name, the way she used to say it when I was small and it was dark and I was frightened. I think the forest has been practicing. There are 142 active case files in the redacted archives. I have personally reviewed 111 of them. I am retired now, in the technical sense of the word. I sit in a chair that is too soft for my back, and I drink tea that has gone cold before I remember to drink it. And sometimes, on the long evenings when the radiator ticks and the window shows me nothing but my own reflection, I open the files again. Not all of them deserve to be opened again. Case file 080 is one I have opened 17 times. Each time I tell myself it will be the last. The subject's name has been redacted per standard protocol. I will call her Marin. That is not her name, but it is close enough to the shape of her, close enough to the way she moved through the world before she found the room inside the limestone, before she learned what the forest does with what it takes. Marin was 63 years old at the time of her initial discovery, a retired seamstress. She had lived her entire life in a hollow in the southern Appalachians, a place the local maps labeled with a name I am not permitted to repeat, in a county that has produced a disproportionate number of missing persons reports over the last 140 years. The archives are aware of the county. The archives have always been aware of the county. Our inaction is a matter I have raised formally on 4 separate occasions, and I will not raise again, because I am retired now, in the technical sense of the word. Marin's late husband had been a geologist, amateur but thorough. When he died, 8 years before the events of this file, he left her a house full of survey maps, limestone samples, and handwritten notebooks detailing the cave systems beneath the hollow. Marin had never read them while he was alive. She found them useful after, when the loneliness of the hollow became the kind of quiet that needed filling. She began exploring the shallower cave mouths that autumn. This is documented in her own diary, which was recovered and has been partially archived. Her handwriting was precise and small, the handwriting of a woman who had spent decades measuring thread by fractions of an inch. She first found the weaving room on a Tuesday in October. October had come in cold that year, the way it sometimes does in the mountains. Not gradually, but all at once, as if the season had simply decided. The maples had gone to red, and the sourwood had gone to purple, and the mornings tasted of wood smoke from neighbors she could not see through the tree line. Maren walked the same limestone ridge she had walked a dozen times before. Her husband's survey maps were folded in her vest pocket. She carried a headlamp on an elastic band, and a canvas bag with a thermos, and a small geological hammer that she did not know how to use correctly, but carried because he had always carried one. The ridge dropped off sharply about a quarter mile from the house. She had noted the drop before, had noted the crack in the rock face, long and vertical, like something had pressed a thumb into the stone and dragged it downward. She had not gone through the crack before because it was narrow, and the dark inside it was a particular quality of dark she did not have a word for. That Tuesday, something was different. There was a smell coming from the crack. Not unpleasant. That is important, and the case file notes it specifically. The smell was not unpleasant. It was damp limestone, and something beneath the limestone, something that reminded Maren, in her own diary, of the inside of a cedar chest, of old fabric, of a room that has been closed for a very long time and still holds the shape of what it once stored. She turned sideways and pressed through the crack. The passage beyond was tighter than it appeared and longer than she expected. She moved with her back to one wall and her hands flat against the other, feeling the cool sweat of the stone against her palms, and the headlamp threw a pale oval of light ahead of her that showed her only more passage, more gray, more dark. She told herself she would go back. She told herself this at 3 separate points in the passage. At each point, she did not go back. The passage opened. She came into the room without warning. One step, she was in the narrow dark, and the next, she was standing in a chamber that her headlamp could not fully illuminate. She could sense the ceiling more than see it, felt the way the darkness piled upward. The floor was flat limestone, worn smooth by water that had not moved through it in centuries. And there were the threads. She wrote about him for 3 full pages in her diary before she allowed herself to describe anything else. This is how I know the description is accurate. It was the thing her mind went to first and stayed with longest. They ran from the far wall of the chamber, from cracks in the limestone so fine she could not see them without pressing her face close. And they crossed the chamber in long, nearly horizontal lines, vanishing into a second passage on the opposite side. Dozens of them, perhaps more than dozens. They were silver, or they appeared silver in the headlamp's light, though she would later write that silver was not quite the right word. Silver is a cold color, she wrote. These were not cold. They caught the light the way certain old threads catch afternoon light through a window, with a warmth inside them, as though the light were passing through something living rather than reflecting from something metal. They were thin, thinner than silk, thinner than spider silk. She brought her face close to one, and she could barely see it, could only confirm it was real by pressing her finger to it, softly, the way you press a finger to a surface to test for dust. It vibrated, a single note, low and resonant, the kind of frequency that lives in the chest rather than the ear. She pulled her hand back. The thread continued to vibrate for longer than it should have. She counted without meaning to. Her mind defaulted to counting the way it had always defaulted, from decades of counting stitches, counting lengths, counting the intervals between things. The thread vibrated for 11 seconds after she had ceased to touch it. She did not touch another thread that day. She went home, and she made herself dinner, and she sat in her husband's chair by the wood stove, and she thought about what she had heard. Not music, not quite, but arranged. That was the word she used in her diary. The sound was arranged, as though someone had placed it there deliberately, had tuned it to a specific note for a specific purpose. She went back the next morning. Over the following 2 weeks, Marin returned to the weaving room every day. She brought a headlamp with better batteries, and then a second headlamp, and then a small battery-powered lantern that gave her a wider field of light and let her see the chamber more completely. It was larger than her first impression had allowed, perhaps 40 feet across, irregular at the edges, with the threads crossing it at varying heights, some near the floor, some at waist height, some high enough that she had to tilt her head back to see where they vanished into the ceiling cracks. She began to understand, slowly, that the chamber was not a natural formation altered by the threads. The threads were the point of the chamber. The chamber existed to hold them. She found eventually that the threads were not identical. Each one vibrated at a different frequency. Each one, when touched, produced a different note. This is where Marin's experience as a seamstress became significant. And, I believe, this is why the forest chose her for what came next, if choosing is a concept that applies to what the forest does. She had an ear for thread, for tension, for the relationship between thickness and vibration and length. She began to map the threads by frequency, by feel, by the length of their sustained note after contact. She filled a notebook with these observations. She used the system of notation she invented herself, part musical notation, part the shorthand of her trade. She did not yet understand that she was reading names. It was on the 17th day that she touched the thread she recognized. She had been working her way methodically from the left wall of the chamber toward the center, touching each thread in sequence and marking her notation. The lantern was bright and steady. The cave smelled of cedar and limestone and the deep, untouched cold of underground. She was calm. She had achieved, over these 17 days, a researcher's calm, the kind that comes not from the absence of strangeness, but from familiarity with it. She touched the thread. It vibrated for exactly 11 seconds, as they all did. And in those 11 seconds, she heard her daughter's voice. Her daughter, Carrie, who had gone missing 4 years prior, who had walked into the woods one January morning to collect firewood and had not come back, whose case was still technically open with the county sheriff, whose photograph was still on the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a pineapple. Carrie's voice, saying a word Maren could not quite resolve, something that bent the air the way a word bends air when it is spoken in another room, through a wall, and you catch the shape, but not the content. Maren let go of the thread. She sat down on the floor of the cave. She sat there for a very long time. The notation in her diary from that day covers 2 pages and is largely illegible. The only time in all the recovered notebooks that her precise small handwriting loses its shape. What can be read suggests that she understood, in the sitting, what the threads were, what they carried, that the silver was not fiber, and was not wire, and was not anything that had been manufactured, that it had grown from the forest the way mycelium grows, except inward, into the limestone, into the chamber, across the room, and out again through the second passage, into the deeper dark of the earth, and that the voices inside the threads were not echoes, they were current. Carrie was not dead in the way Maren had feared. The forest had not destroyed her daughter. It had taken her apart, had found the frequency of her, had found the specific vibration that a human voice makes when it is shaped by a particular body, a particular set of bones and cartilage and muscle memory. And it had drawn that frequency out, had stretched it, had woven it into something that could be stored. The forest was a loom. This is the language the case file uses. The forest was a loom, and the people it took were thread. Maren touched the thread again. This time she held it. The case file documents what happened to Marin's hands over the following weeks. I will not read those details aloud. I will say only that the changes were consistent with the other recovered subjects, the two others in the history of the archives who had made contact with a Loom site and sustained prolonged exposure. The skin of her fingertips became translucent, not metaphorically, not as a symptom of illness, literally translucent, thin enough eventually that you could see through her fingertips to the light behind them. She lost her voice on the 41st day, not to illness, not to silence, to pitch. Her voice from that point forward carried a harmonic inside it that had not been there before, a secondary frequency, a resonance that was not hers. Carrie's frequency. What Marin had done, what she could not stop herself from doing once she understood, was weave herself. She had pressed her living frequency against her daughter's thread until the two had begun to merge. She had made herself both seamstress and thread. The forest had let her. The forest, I think, had been waiting for someone to do exactly that. Whether she succeeded, whether the merging of frequencies restored anything that had been taken, or whether it simply added one more thread to the loom, is a question the archives cannot answer. Marin's house was found empty in the spring. The notebooks were on the kitchen table, weighted with a limestone sample from her husband's collection. The survey maps were gone. The crack in the ridge face has since been sealed by the county, ostensibly for safety reasons. There are 3 other cave mouths in the hollow that her husband's notebooks identify as connected to the same system. They have not been sealed. The archives are aware of this. There are currently 47 missing persons reports associated with that county, going back to 1883. 47 names. I have read each of them. I think sometimes about whether each one has a thread, whether the loom is patient enough, and I believe it is. I believe patience is the only thing the forest has in abundance. To have kept all 47, to have tuned 47 lengths of silver to 47 particular frequencies, stored in a chamber in the limestone beneath the hollow. I think about Marin's daughter, Carrie. I think about a cold January morning and a woman walking into the trees for firewood. I think about what the forest heard in her voice, what it recognized, what it decided to keep. I am closing case file 080 now for the 17th time. The file closes the way it always closes, not with an answer, but with the understanding that some questions are themselves a kind of thread. that to pull at them is to become part of the weaving. The hollow is quiet tonight. Everything in it is exactly where the forest wants it to be. The archive is getting cold. You can feel it if you've been here long enough. The way the air changes when you're moving toward the ones that don't want to be found. This record has no clear origin. The location listed in the ledger is just a word. Hollow. No county, no coordinates. Just the understanding that you'd know the place if you'd ever stood in it. That particular kind of quiet, where your voice goes out and nothing comes back at the right time, or from the right direction. Someone lives in that delay, moves through it, has learned to lift what belongs to you right out of the air before the echo can return it. They say the stolen ones don't go silent. That's the cruelest part. They keep speaking. Your pitch, your cadence, the specific way you soften certain words, just emptied of the thing that made them yours. If you hear yourself out there in the dark tonight, coming from somewhere you aren't, don't correct it. Don't call out. The worst thing you can do is give it something fresh to compare itself against. It's already close enough. Now, settle in. Get comfortable. The story I'm about to tell comes from the Blue Ridge Mountains, those ancient folds of Appalachia, where fog doesn't lift so much as it settles, becoming part of the air itself, becoming part of you if you stay long enough. People who've never lived in deep mountain country don't understand what silence really means. In cities, silence is just absence, emptiness. But in the mountains, in the hollows, silence is alive. It's a presence. It has weight. These mountains are old, worn down by time into shapes that almost look soft. But don't mistake that for gentle. They're patient. They're listening. These mountains hold on to things. They hold on to sounds. A voice called into a holler decades ago might still echo through the rock faces, through the root systems beneath the earth. Sound doesn't disappear there. It accumulates. It pools. It waits. What I'm about to share is Case File 073. It comes from the deep archives. It involves a man named Silas Brandt, a retired search and rescue veteran who spent 43 years finding people in those mountains. He knew them better than his own face. Every ridge, every ravine, every twisted path. He was the mountain's servant in a way. A voice calling in the dark, a light in the wilderness. 3 years ago, Silas's wife Martha passed away. 3 weeks ago, Silas started hearing something at 3 a.m. He heard Martha's voice calling from Kettle Hollow, the deep gorge behind his cabin. The thing that called itself Martha wasn't Martha at all. And what happened next is why we're here. It's why you need to listen to this story. Because the thing in that hollow is still calling, and it's learned new voices since Silas disappeared. It might know yours. It's 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Silas stands at the edge of Kettle Hollow. His flashlight cuts through darkness, disappearing into the gorge below. He's been here hundreds of times, but never at this hour. Never when the mountain speaks. His breath comes in small clouds. October. The temperature has dropped like something thrown down into darkness. His flashlight hand trembles. Not from cold, from recognition. Because it's happening now. The voice. And Silas is hearing his own name called back to him. Not Martha's voice anymore. Not the ghost of his wife, gone 3 years into the ground. His own voice. His own inflections. The way he pronounced certain words. The slight rasp from quitting smoking in '98. Silas, it calls. Silas, come down here. And the terrible thing, the thing that will haunt you when you're trying to sleep, is that he almost does. He almost takes that step, because the voice is so perfectly his own, because some wounded part of him, the part that lost his wife to cancer, wants desperately to answer. The flashlight beam shakes. Below, the hollow sounds like breathing. And Silas understands in that moment that he's made a terrible mistake. Not tonight, weeks ago. The mistake happened the first time he ignored what he was hearing. The first time he let the thing know he could hear it. Now it's learning his voice, practicing it, getting closer. Let me take you back, 3 weeks prior. Let me show you Silas's life as it was. The cabin sits on a south-facing slope, 1 mile from the nearest paved road. Built in 1967 by a man named Claytor Hughes, who raised tobacco until his hands wouldn't hold a tool anymore. Silas bought it in 1994. Board and batten siding painted deep burgundy. Metal roof, it sounds like rain in storms. 2 chimneys of stone, mortared by Hughes's own hands. The cabin sits at the head of Kettle Hollow. The hollow runs 3 miles down and eastward, eventually emptying into Crabtree Creek. Slopes steep, nearly 60 degrees in places. The floor is filled with hemlocks and cedar, moss-covered rocks the size of cars, water that runs year-round. Even in drought years, water runs in Kettle Hollow. Some places don't dry out. Silas didn't used to fear Kettle Hollow. He'd been down it 100 times, searching. In 1987, he found a hiker missing for 4 days. Broken leg near a formation locals called the Devil's Throne. He'd rappelled down, splinted the leg, brought the man up. He knew the hollow. It knew him. But something had changed. It started on a Monday night. Silas was sitting in his armchair reading a mystery novel, bourbon beside him. The television was off. The house was quiet, the way it always was since Martha died. He'd learned to fill the silence with books and small routines and prescribed sleep aids. And then, at 3 a.m. exactly, the grandfather clock in the hallway had just finished chiming. He heard it. A voice. It came through the walls. Not loud, not alarming, just present, as if the house itself had exhaled it. It sounded like breathing shaped into words. Among those half-formed syllables, He could almost make out a voice he knew, a voice that had said his name 10,000 times over the course of a marriage. Silas. His name, drawn out across several seconds, the way Martha used to call him when he'd been outside too long and she wanted him to come in for supper. He didn't get up. He didn't go to the window. He simply sat there, bourbon growing warm in his hand, and listened to the wind move through Kettle Hollow, carrying with it the ghost of his wife's voice. In the morning, he tried to convince himself he'd imagined it. He was wrong. By the end of the first week, it was happening every night. Always at 3 a.m., always starting with his name. Always that same tone, sad, patient, almost gentle, as if Martha was waiting for him to remember something, as if his grief had an answer, and she was holding it just beyond the hollows and ridge lines. Silas tried to ignore it. He tried sleeping with earplugs, foam ones you roll between your fingers and wedge into the ear canal. That didn't work. The voice seemed to phase around them, traveling through his skull instead of his ears. He could feel it in his teeth, in the fillings, in the bone itself. By the end of the second week, he'd bought expensive noise-canceling headphones, medical grade, the kind used in sensory deprivation therapy. He set up a speaker beside the bed and played white noise, rain on metal roofs, rushing water, wind through leaves. All night, midnight until dawn. 8 hours of static between him and the hollow. For 3 nights it worked. He actually slept through until 6 a.m. He woke refreshed for the first time in weeks. He thought he'd won. He thought technology could save him from the mountain. But on the 4th night, something changed. Silas woke at 3 a.m., and the white noise had stopped. The headphones were dead. And in that silence, that terrible, absolute silence, he heard something else entirely. It was coming from inside the cabin structure, from the walls, from the copper pipes running through the house. The voice was vibrating through the plumbing. The metal was resonating, turning the entire house into an instrument. A tuning fork struck, and humming at a frequency that made his spine ache. The whole cabin was singing with Martha's voice. And underneath Martha's voice, underneath that familiar tone, Silas could hear something else. Something deeper, a frequency that made his bones ache, a sound like metal groaning in extreme cold, like insects screaming at the edge of human hearing, like the earth itself breathing. He tore the headphones off and sat in the darkness, trembling. His heart was racing. His mouth tasted like copper. The same metal singing through the pipes. The voice was louder now, not aggressive, not angry, but insistent. It wasn't calling his name anymore. It was speaking in sentences, saying things Martha had said, small things, intimate things, pet names, jokes they'd shared, the way she used to ask him during that final year when cancer made her afraid if he would be okay without her. "I'm here," the voice said, "perfectly, Martha, but also not, because it was coming from the very bones of the house, from the copper and the wood and the stone. I'm here, Silas. I came back. I never really left." He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his armchair until dawn, drinking cold coffee, watching the darkness gradually lift from the windows. The voice faded as the sun crested the eastern ridges, but he could still feel it vibrating in the pipes, still humming, still waiting. But he'd already understood by then that something fundamental had changed. The thing in Kettle Hollow had noticed that he'd noticed it, and it was getting closer. It was learning. It was listening to him now, the way he'd been listening to it. Desperation does strange things to people. On the 15th day, Silas drove into town. 20 minutes down the mountain through switchbacks he'd driven 1,000 times, and went to the SAR station. The building had been updated, new computers, modern radio system, but the files were still there. Old cases, old reports, stored in filing cabinets in a climate-controlled basement room. He had a friend there, a woman named Donna Chen, who'd worked with him for 15 years. She didn't ask many questions. She simply pulled out the boxes marked 1975 through 1982 and left him alone. Silas's hand shook as he went through the files. At first, nothing. Routine rescues. A hiker lost. A child wandered off. Standard incidents. But then, buried in a 1977 file, he found something labeled Acoustic Anomalies, Kettle Hollow, Incident Report. The report was written by a ranger named Cole Pittman. It described disturbances reported by residents near the hollow. Strange voices calling in the night. The voices sounding like missing persons who'd supposedly been found days or weeks earlier. One case involved a young woman named Rebecca Ellis, missing for 5 days. When found, dehydrated but alive, sheltering in a cave, she claimed she'd heard her own voice calling from deeper in the hollow. She described it as familiar but wrong, like listening to a recording of yourself, except the recording was changing. The implications made Silas's chest tight. How many people had heard these voices over decades? How many had walked down into that hollow, drawn by sound of their own grief? Cole Pittman's conclusion was short. No scientific explanation found. Recommend environmental evaluation of hollow for geological formations that might cause acoustic distortion. Nothing had come of it. The anomalies had stopped. Life had moved on. Perhaps no one had been listening with the right kind of attention. No one desperate enough. No one alone enough. But Silas understood now. They had stopped because there had been no one to listen properly. No one isolated and grieving enough to hear what the mountain wanted to say. He replaced the files carefully and drove home in the fading light. At 3 a.m. the voice would start again, and this time he would know exactly what it was. Which brings us back to that moment at the edge of Kettle Hollow, at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, with Silas standing on the precipice, hearing his own voice call up from the darkness. "Come down here, Silas. Come where it's warm." And that's when Silas understands the final horror. It isn't about getting him to the hollow. It was never about drawing him down into those ancient rocks. The thing has already moved inside. It's in the walls. It's in the copper pipes. It's in the floorboards and the insulation. It doesn't need him to come to the hollow. The hollow is already inside his house, inside his chest, inside the place where his grief lives like a second tenant. When Silas goes back inside that cabin, and he does go back inside because there's nowhere else to go, he finds Martha sitting in his armchair, or something wearing her voice like skin, and it smiles at him with a mouth that opens too wide, and it says, "We can't go back, Silas, but we don't have to go forward either. We can just stay here, in this moment, in this hollow, where the mountains hold on to everything forever." And Silas closes his eyes. The next morning, a neighbor found his house empty. No signs of struggle, just an open door and Silas's shoes placed neatly side by side on the front porch. They searched Kettle Hollow for 3 weeks. They never found him. But if you live in those mountains, if you've ever come near those ridges in the deep hours of the morning, you might hear something strange. A voice calling from the rocks. And if you listen closely, you might recognize it as your own. If you aren't asleep yet, the archives are deep, so very deep. And there are more files waiting, more cases, More voices calling from the hollows of places that time has forgotten. Join the all-night horror playlist. Link on the end screen. Let the darkness carry you down, the way the mountain carries sound. Let it settle in your bones and your teeth and the copper pipes of your own small house. And remember, as you drift toward sleep, if you hear your name called from the trees, if you hear a voice that sounds exactly like your own, don't answer. Sleep well. Last one for tonight. We always save this file for the end. Not because it's the worst. It isn't, not exactly. But because it's the kind of thing that needs darkness already settled around you before it makes its full sense. It concerns appetite, the development of it. Most things are born knowing what they need, or close enough to knowing that the gap doesn't matter. But there are others, younger things or older things that were somehow interrupted, that are still in the process of figuring out what they're for, what they're drawn to, what, given the right conditions, they might reach toward. The sounds on this tape are best described as searching, exploratory. The way a new feeling moves through something that didn't have feelings last season. We don't know what they've settled on wanting. The tape doesn't go that far. It ends right at the edge of the decision, which is either reassuring or the most frightening thing in the archive, depending on how you look at it. Get some rest. Pull whatever's nearest to you a little closer. They're right at the threshold of understanding. That long, breathless moment just before a thing figures out it's hungry. Sleep now, while that moment still holds. It won't stay a moment much longer. The cellar's where I'm hiding when it comes. The scratching starts around midnight. Metallic. That's what gets me. It don't sound like claws. Sounds like brass learning how to want. The door's oak, solid, but I can see where the finish is coming away in strips. Like something's methodical about it. Patient. I know what's on the other side. I've seen it in that violet light. I've watched it, watching me. I reckon you want the story. Well, settle yourself. This ain't gonna be quick, but it's gotta be told. My name don't matter much no more. Folks around Shady Creek call me the Surveyor. Spent 42 years walking these mountains with theodolite and chains, measuring what couldn't rightly be measured. The Appalachian range, she's got her own cartography, her own way of keeping secrets. Shady Creek itself ain't much, just a holler between two ridges where the sun don't spend much time. The creek only runs heavy after rain. Folks who tried farming that soil back in the day, they didn't stay long. Said it felt conscious, aware, like something was watching from underneath. These mountains have got stories, old stories, the kind that don't get wrote down official-like. Stories about 1890. Stories about settlers who came thinking they'd found paradise, then found something else entirely. Stories about what they did to keep it contained. The smell of coming rain in these mountains is distinct, heavy, mineral-like, iron and stone and something else. Something that smells like a root cellar sealed 100 years, where the darkness got thick enough to have a smell. That's what the air was like the day I went to Shady Creek proper. That's what it smelled like when I found the lantern. It had been dry 3 weeks. The creek bed was exposed like a wound. Chalk-white stones and cracked mud arranged in patterns that looked almost intentional. I was looking for old surveying markers, brass plates, stones, testimony to man's arrogance in measuring infinity. I found something else that day. It was wedged between 2 stones 40 feet down the creek bed, in the spot where spring thaw water would gather. The brass was tarnished black in places, but even with all that oxidation, I could tell it was quality work, old work, the kind of craftsmanship that takes time and intention and purpose you believe in completely. It was a lantern. Not like any general store lantern. Traditional, 4-sided with glass panels on all sides. The brass frame was worked with designs that made no sense to me. Geometrical, intentional. Patterns that seemed to follow some logic I couldn't grasp. The kind of designs you might see in old grimoires, if you read such things, which I don't, not usually. The weight surprised me. Heavy, substantial, like it was filled with something more than air and void. When I picked it up with both hands, my forearms felt the strain immediately. This was a thing made to be held with respect. The glass panels were pristine. Not a crack, not a smudge, not a single sign of weathering. After however many decades in Shady Creek, exposed to freeze and thaw and the slow work of rust and time, it looked like it had been polished that morning. I picked it up. My hands knew it was wrong, but my curiosity, That old surveyor's need to see, to record, to know, it overrode good sense. I wrapped it in my jacket and carried it home. My house sits a mile up from the holler, high ground. That evening the sky was clearing. Gold and red light from the west made everything look like it was burning from inside. I lit the lantern on the back porch. There wasn't no oil in it, but when I scraped a match against my boot and touched the flame to where the wick should be, something ignited. The flame was violet. Not orange, not red, not yellow, not no normal color fire makes in this world. Violet, a cold violet, like the light that comes off deep water when the moon's high, and the water's been cold since before you were born. The flame didn't flicker. It burned steady, patient, like it had been waiting in that lantern for a very long time. The air changed. Not temperature, though my skin felt cold in ways that got nothing to do with wind. It was the weight of the air. Like the atmosphere itself had thickened, become dense, become aware of my presence. And when I looked around the porch, the rocking chairs, the rail, the trees beyond, the corners of the world started flickering. That's the only word for it. Flickering. Like someone switching a light on and off real slow. Each time it flickered, the world looked different. Just slightly. Just enough that I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it was a dream. But I kept the lantern wrapped in cloth on a shelf in the cellar. And that night, against every instinct, against everything rational, I carried it into the woods toward Shady Creek. The familiar path became something else in the darkness. The violet light turned the green forest into shades of purple and deep blue. The undergrowth became alien. The ferns looked like they had too many fronds. The trees became towers of shadow that seemed to lean inward. It was gradual. That's the important thing to understand. Not a dramatic threshold. Like walking through a door that's always slightly ajar, that's been ajar for 130 years. With each step toward the creek bed, the hinges creaked wider. The barrier between now and then got thinner. The first thing I noticed was the buildings. A settlement in Shady Creek. Not no modern sign of it. No foundations, no chimneys, nothing archaeology could find. But in the violet light, they were there. 3 cabins, log construction, built with care and precision that suggested permanence, impossibility, intention. They looked more real than my own house. The second thing I noticed was the people. They weren't right. They moved too slow, like they were existing in water thicker than normal water, more resistant to motion. Their shapes would flicker at the edges, uncertain, like the light couldn't quite hold them stable. And they were aware of me. I could feel it before I saw it. That moment when their heads turned, all at once, all toward my position, like I was the only thing in their world that mattered. I should have run then, should have hurled that lantern back into the creek and never thought again. But the surveyor in me, the part that needed to understand, to document, to see, that part wanted knowledge. So I walked deeper. The flickering intensified. The world became less stable. One moment I stood in modern forest, trees familiar, ground known. The next I stood in something that had been deliberately kept. The ground was cleared. Trees had been marked with old cuts and arranged in patterns that suggested function, purpose, design. Traps. They were traps. I could see the mechanism now, even though no mechanism existed in modern day. Earth dug and shaped into angles. Trees felled in strategic locations. And the light, the violet light, it was showing me what the light had been for. Containment. The 1890 settlers had used light to keep something in place, something that shouldn't move, something that shouldn't leave. And I realized what was strange about the people. They weren't flickering from damage or time's corruption. They were flickering from effort. Like keeping their shape stable in this modern era required constant work. Like they were pushing against a barrier that wanted to scatter them, to disperse them back into whatever realm they'd inhabited. And then the largest one moved toward me. I don't know how to describe what I saw. In the violet light it had something like a shape, but wrong in ways that make your eyes hurt. More angles than a body should have. Proportions shifted depending on viewing angle. When it made a sound, a grinding like rocks in a cement mixer, like continents shifting, like time breaking, I felt it rearrange something fundamental in how my body understood the world. That's when survival instinct overrode curiosity. I turned. I ran. The violet light swung wildly through the forest, showing me both the modern world and that other world, that echo overlap. The two bled into each other like old photographs colliding. And the creatures, there were more now coming from the cabins, they followed, but slowly, like movement in their world was expensive, like they were learning even as they moved, learning the rules of this new world, learning how to want. I made it back to my house. Just barely. The porch light was still on from when I'd left. The modern world solidified around me, as soon as the violet light stopped being the only light. Like the electric bulb was more real, more insistent, like it had more authority here. But the creatures had followed me out. They stopped at the edge of my property, right where electric light met darkness. In that liminal space, I could see them clearly. The large one with too many angles, the one that had made the sound like breaking time, and several others smaller, more stable, like they were native to this modern era in a way the large one wasn't. They were waiting. I held the lantern in trembling hands. The violet flame burned steady, cold, patient. And in that light, I could see what the creatures were doing. They were learning how to move in this world, learning physics of modern existence, learning how to want things beyond the light, learning desire in a way they hadn't wanted in 130 years. The standoff lasted hours. From midnight until first gray light touched the eastern ridge, I stood on my back porch with that brass lantern and those things, the echo overlap creatures, the hungry things the old settlers had written about in codes and warnings. They stood just beyond the light and learned. They tried moving. They tried shapes. They tried sounds that might convince me to step into darkness, to join them. The smaller ones made noises like children crying from very far away. The large one made sounds like something remembering how to speak after centuries of silence. My legs burned from standing. My arms ached from holding the lantern. The violet flame cast everything in shades of wrong. The grass became deep purple. The porch posts became black towers. The creatures themselves became more defined the longer I watched, as if my observation was teaching them how to be more solid, more real, more here. Then, as gray light became proper dawn, the violet flame began to flicker. Not the world, but the flame itself. It pulsed and guttered like it was running out of fuel, even though there was no fuel. When the flame went out completely, they vanished. Not all at once. They faded. The smaller ones went first, dissolving into darkness like they'd never been real. The large one, the impossible one, it faded last, and I swear I saw it smiling. Smiling like it had learned something it could use. Smiling like it would be back. The lantern felt warm in my hands for the first time. Real warm. brass sitting in sunshine. I set it down on the porch table, hands shaking so bad I nearly dropped it. I went inside, locked the door, and didn't come out until afternoon. That was 6 years ago. 6 years of sleeping in daylight and staying inside when the sun gets low. 6 years of checking doors and locks and keeping all the lights on. The lantern's still on my back porch table. I haven't moved it. Haven't touched it again. I tried once, 3 months after it happened, to carry it back down to Shady Creek. Made it halfway down the path, and I realized the sun was getting low, and I turned back without finishing. I don't go out after dark no more. Ain't nothing to do at night that can't wait for morning anyway. I got my routines. Wake up with dawn, move around during daylight. When the sun gets low, I'm inside. Doors locked, lights on. All of them. Every single bulb. I keep 'em burning even when it seems wasteful. Even when my electric bill looks like something from a fever dream. Sometimes I wonder if that's what the 1890 settlers did. If they locked themselves inside every night, waiting for morning, knowing the dark was when the hungry things were most likely to remember how to move, how to want, how to reach across the gap between their world and ours. Sometimes I wonder if by lighting that lantern, by showing them the echo overlap was still possible, still functional, if I did something unforgivable. But I'm recording this case file, adding it to the dual archive system where the detailed logs go. Detailed logs that go where this one can't. To the Patreon, to the vaults, to the places where the whole story don't fit into neat video packages meant for the all-night horror playlist. For now, you got the gist of it. Shady Creek's got things in it that shouldn't see light. If you find something that glows violet, you leave it be. You leave it in the dark where it belongs. Keep your lights on. Lock your doors. Don't walk in the hollers after sunset. This is the redacted archives. We're still watching, still recording, still finding stories that need telling. The echo overlap's still out there, and I reckon it's still learning. The reels have gone quiet. We've reached the end of what the archive will give us tonight, and we shouldn't ask it for more. Not at this hour. What we've heard has gone where heard things go, down into the soft machinery of sleep, where it will do whatever it intends to do. We'll let it. The rain is still out there. It knows these sounds, has been falling on this mountain long enough to understand what lives here, and it will keep its watch. Trust it. If you surface before the light comes, and some of you will, that's the nature of nights like this. The tapes will be where you left them, patient, still in their cases. They don't mind waiting. They've been waiting a long time already. But for now, the archive is sealed. The ledger is closed. And whatever came close enough tonight to press itself against the glass has had its hour and must recede. Let the mountain settle back into itself. Let the dark mean nothing for a while. You're still here. That's the thing about nights like this. You always come through them still here, even if the coming through changes the shape of you slightly. Sleep now. Sleep well, down into it. The morning will arrive in its own time, and we'll see what the light makes of everything.